Welcome to Planning Live with Dr. Caroline Brown. In her own words, Caroline is a recovering academic, a policy enthusiast, and of course, a chartered town planner. Caroline was a planning academic for a long time, studying at Liverpool before working as a researcher and lecturer in several different universities. She was at Heriot-Watt for almost 18 years before taking up the reins as the new director for RTPI Scotland. Her research covered various aspects of sustainability and health, including blue and green space and active travel. Caroline also supervised a number of doctoral research projects investigating children and the built environment. So welcome, Caroline, and over to you, Karen.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon, Caroline. Great to have you with us this afternoon.
Thanks, Karen.
So, Caroline, you've been in post now for just over 4 months, I think. So can you perhaps start off with giving us your reflections on those first few months and what's been your biggest challenge to date?
Thanks. Yeah, it's really lovely to be here, and thanks for asking me to be part of this this well-known and well-loved series. So yes, it's been 4 months and it's been quite a whirlwind, I can say. And I think my main takeaway so far is it's pretty busy out there. There's really quite a lot to keep up with, just in terms of the consultations, but also the work going on behind the scenes. So the technical groups, the meetings and working groups. I've already been to 2 parliamentary committees since the new year, and plus various other Scottish Government sort of technical working groups around NPF4. What else can I say? National Planning Improvement Champion. He's also been doing lots of things, and we've been talking and involved in that. So that's just the policy side of things. And of course, there's all of the other work that the Institute does with its members and all of our internal kind of meetings and committees on education and accreditation. And yeah, there's a lot happening.
It sounds incredibly busy. And much as I'd like to say, Caroline, that you're just having a busy patch at the moment, but I fear that is our constant state in the world of planning. And I'm sure we'll come back to a few of those issues that you just mentioned in passing as we chat through things today. So we may as well start off with the big one, which a lot of people have been reflecting on recently. So of course, it's a year since NPF4 was adopted, speaking of bedding in, and planners and planning lawyers alike have been sharing their views on those first 12 months. Probably fair to say the good and the bad in that. But what are your thoughts drawing on that first year? And perhaps I'm sure you will receive lots of feedback about how different planners working in different areas of the profession are experiencing things. Perhaps we can start off with some of the positives, just to get off on a good footing. What's been working well, and what are the good news stories?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because I did quite a bit of work on NPF4 before it was finally adopted, and I think I was expecting that to kind of be the end of the story, but of course it's just the beginning of the story. And I think I heard some planners talking earlier this afternoon actually about NPF4, and they were saying they're still trying to get their heads around it. And I think that that bears true for a lot of us. There are lots of positives, and I think the eye-catching policy one on the twin nature and climate emergencies is clearly, was one of the big pluses, and that's had an impact. We've seen an impact on planning decisions. That that policy has led to some decisions being changed, some recommendations being changed.
Absolutely.
And I think from a kind of with my academic sort of hat on, it puts a sustainability issues right at the sort of centre of planning in a way that it hadn't done before. And always before we'd been given the opt-out of kind of balancing sustainability versus economic development, or other kind of considerations, and it allowed policymakers and politicians to downplay environmental concerns, whereas NPF4 says right at the top, these have to be given significant weight. And policy 2 as well about emissions also kind of puts that very significant weight on the climate emergency. And I think just in kind of policy discourse, and that was a really significant change. So that's, for me, has been really a real big plus. And I think there are some other positives. I've heard from some members who are quite senior officers who've been saying that NPF4 has really cemented commitments around the place principle, around quality, these ideas about local living and 20-minute neighbourhoods. NPF4 is helping them to have those conversations with developers, making it easier for those, for them to back up in a kind of policy way those sorts of ambitions. So that is also a big plus. Evidently, the place principle has been in Scottish policy for a while, but NPF4 has really cemented that in the planning sense. So I think that's also a big positive. Yeah,
making sure that the best of practice now absolutely has to be embedded in the approach that developers are taking to things, and we're seeing that reflected across decisions.
Yeah, and I think developers are also getting the message about that. And I think one of the other things about NPF4, which again is perhaps a little bit different to previous planning policies at national level, has been the interest from the third sector, from campaigners and environmental groups. I've seen a number of campaign groups having briefing sessions about NPF4 and what it means, and they're looking at it and how they can use it to put pressure on and campaign for positive things to happen. Yeah, really interesting that different sectors are looking at this, different perspectives.
And I think that perhaps reflects the sheer breadth of some of the themes that are in there, which was something that was discussed when the draft came forward, and obviously it then evolved before adoption. But we've seen that for many years, that the field of topics that planning has to be interested in and try and solve, different problems of society. It's an ever-growing list, and I think that list certainly has continued to grow with NPF4. But I'm sure it's now hitting buttons for a number of those interest groups, as you say, perhaps in a way that didn't in the past, and probably that is a good thing, but something that we all have to get used to as we go about our business. Something which is perhaps less well recognised, or certainly I haven't heard it talked about as much, but I know it's an issue that's quite dear to your heart, is the greater emphasis that we see in NPF4 on involving children and young people more actively in the planning system as users of those livable spaces that we are trying to create, and I suppose as citizens whose views should be sought and reflected in planning decisions and the way we go about our planning. Do you think that is beginning to change the way that policymakers, decision makers will need to approach planning, and can we expect that perhaps to have a difference or make a difference in terms of outcomes?
Well, I think as a general principle, I think it's really wonderful, and I've been really supportive of, and was really delighted to see this back, I think, in 2015 when we had the review of the Scottish planning system, because it was one of the recommendations that came out of that report. And in fact, it was built around, or part of the evidence base came from a PhD that I'd supervised at Heriot-Watt, which was around children in the planning system. And
I did not know that.
Yes, Jenny Wood, big shout out to Jenny Wood. Some people may know her, still doing excellent work around planning and children. But so it's been I think it's a really excellent move for Scottish planning to have that embedded in the Act and in the guidance. And I think it's also coming through in some of the conversations I've been having with practitioners, that they're talking to young people in a way that they haven't ever done before. They're going to schools, they're going to groups, they're asking young people about how they feel about their neighbourhoods, where they go, where they don't go, the sorts of things they like and dislike. And in doing so, they're realising that there's a lot of information they don't have. The planners don't know where young people hang out. They don't know what they think about the sorts of the spaces that there are. We think about young children and play parks, but teens, those kind of difficult group, where do they go? and we don't know a lot about them. We don't collect data about them. We often ask questions and have surveys that are only open to adults. So we only ask people who are over 18 about their travel habits, for example. So I think these new conversations are revealing new things for planners and practitioners. And I'm hoping, big hope for the Institute and for the profession, is that those conversations will also be of interest to the young people and get them to start thinking about their neighbourhoods and, you know, what it might mean to be in a job that's about shaping those places in the future. So yeah, I think one of the things
opportunity. Sorry, on you go, Caroline.
I was just going to finish up and say, yeah, one of the other things that's come through from a couple of conversations I've had is that the planners have found it really revealing about the different experiences of young men and young women in their neighbourhoods, and, you know, that, yeah, the issues that we recognise around personal safety for young girls and women, but also that the young guys they don't know about it. They don't even twig that the young women are going to completely different places. And again, that's creating sort of some interesting conversations for the policymakers to think about. How do we respond to this? What are the sorts of things that we need to do to address this? And hopefully opening some new conversations with the young people as well about what that means for them. And yeah,
bringing in those new perspectives. And it's interesting, I mean, we've spoken before about local place plans on the podcast as a vehicle to be having new conversations with different sections of the community and sections that don't necessarily sort of engage in the development management process in the way that it's often recognised that perhaps it's a typical cohort that may do that. So I think any opportunity to be widening those conversations and getting a fuller perspective on the communities that planning needs to serve can only be a good thing. Obviously, we saw the police efficiency regulations and the guidance around those come in just towards the end of the year, and that's looking at, I guess, those interests from a very particular perspective, but it's certainly a much wider conversation. And with NPF4 hitting those themes around nature, crisis and environment that are of such interest to young people, it hopefully helps to spark that interest. Okay, so we've had a bit of a chat there about positives. Then thinking about some of the less positive things, what about other sectors other than renewables?
Yeah, I think there's lots of focus on, you know, the housing, and I know I know we could go into a whole different conversation about some of the legal challenges around the housing decisions and allocations, I think. So on a positive note, yes, it's good for placemaking and that kind of quality angle, but we've got issues around allocation of sites and all of the interpretations of that. Obviously waiting for that legal decision, which will shape things as well. And a huge concern, Moss End, huge concern I know from the development industry about the switch into the new development plans, the 10-year supply, but the kind of the middle, how are we going to cope without enough land being allocated until we've got our new plans in place, and the time it's going to take for all of that to work through. So I think that's a big kind of strategic worry about housing delivery, set against, of course, the housing emergencies that have been declared. Exactly. And we had homelessness figures earlier in the week, and I was at Parliament talking about housing to 2040 with other stakeholders, so also talking about that acute crisis in housing. And so there are concerns, of course, that what's happening with planning and NPF4 isn't going to help to solve that. It's potentially going to make some of that worse. However, yes, you know, that's where we are, and I think
lots of conversations going around that, and hopefully we'll get some clarity perhaps towards the end of March in terms of the Court of Session decision. But as you say, really until we're beginning to see that new raft of LDPs coming in, it's going to be a challenging time, I think, for house builders.
Yeah, and I think that also ties into some of the other concerns, I think, which are around So the time lag between, where we are now and having a new set of LDPs, but also the interpretation of other bits of guidance. So on whether that's on rural housing policy, on the biodiversity side of things, they're working through what this means in practice. So when you're giving guidance to a developer or you're making a decision or a determination, there's still a lot of gaps, and we're of course also waiting for Scottish Government to issue guidance on different elements of NPF4. So the local living, for example, we've got work going on around climate, and there's biodiversity guidance which has been published just before Christmas. So there's this ongoing raft of additional guidance that's sitting next to NPF4, all of which is still to emerge and in different stages of emergence, and practitioners on the ground are saying that's part of the challenge for them. And I think the other issue is about the diversity of Scotland. There's a lot of policy written here in quite general terms, but when you're in a place, whether as a developer or as a local authority, you're having to interpret it in a specific, and how you make these words work in your context, whether that's a rural island context or or wherever it is, that nuance about how it works in this place. And I think that's one of the other challenges of NPF4.
It's having the freedom to do that. Undoubtedly, when the new LDPs emerge, and the dates are such that a new LDP is then ahead in date from the NPF4, it allows the authority to set out its stall, but it's the challenge in getting to that point, and as you say, recognising the flexibility that we need to take account of different circumstances across Scotland. But I mean, I think you're right. Undoubtedly, all of these things and all of these ongoing pieces of work will take time. We're slowly beginning to get, I suppose, clarity coming, or some clarity coming through in certain areas. We recently had the court decision from in the Wildcat Haven case, which was a renewables case, where the court had actually looked at interpretation of the mitigation hierarchy under policy 3, and no doubt there will be other similar decisions and challenges which will begin to shed a bit of light on all of that. But it's difficult for both public sector planners and private private consultants who are trying to give best advice to their clients in the meantime, while all of this beds down. But you mentioned biodiversity, just to pick up on that, Caroline, because of course that is, I suppose, one of the other big topics that's been under discussion this year. We've had the statutory requirements recently coming into force in England with their the sort of 10% requirement, and Scottish Government guidance published in Scotland, as you mentioned, quite recently, while SNH work on the new metric continues. But I suppose, leaving aside the technical issues with all of that, how is the profession coping with these new demands?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pragmatism from what I've been hearing. We know, so at a local level, people are interpreting things. I've heard Scottish officers talking about how they're using or not using the English, some of the English metrics while we're waiting for the Scottish metric or measure to be finalised. In other cases, they're using professional judgment to determine whether there's been an enhancement or not. So there's a lot of pragmatism, and I think for some officers, they've got some skills and they've got some knowledge in this area, but a lot of our members are saying we feel we lack confidence on this topic, and there's a lot of demand for information and guidance and training on biodiversity. And I think that's across the nations, because we know Wales is also developing some kind of similar policy area, although they've said at national level they're not going to go for a metric, they're going to have kind of enhancement sort of criteria. But again, it's all emerging. We did a recent survey with our members asking about this, and the confidence around biodiversity was very, very low. I think only 2 out of 10 sort of felt that they had some confidence around that topic. And we had a webinar a couple of weeks ago. We had 900 people signed up for that. So there's huge demands.
That tells its own story, doesn't it, in terms of those numbers?
Absolutely. And I know we've got a number of other BNG webinars happening over the next few months. So if you haven't been to one yet and that's something you need to do, please do come and have a look at our events and get yourself signed up. And I think, we need the guidance in place from the key agencies. We need training, we need events, we need that to be offered across the board. It needs to be for developers, not just for local authority planners. And we've lost some of those skills at local authority level, haven't we? We know, cutting budgets, the austerity over the last however many years has meant local authorities have lost some of those specialist skills. So they might have had an ecologist in the past or a tree officer, and often those posts have gone. And so, where do those planners turn to for that expertise? It can be easier in private practice because you might have an ecologist in the team or that you're able to work with, but it can be harder in the public sector. And I suppose the role of the institute is to kind of support our members in giving them the information and access to to appropriate CPD events where we can. So it's definitely huge on the agenda for the Institute. We've had a clear message from members that this is one of the things they're desperate to have help with. So there's a lot of work and lots of things happening on biodiversity, and that's only going to continue. I can't see it finishing soon.
Well, that's certainly the positive, and people should certainly look up the programme and make sure that they're accessing what's available on that. But I suppose it does sort of nicely take us on to the issue of resourcing of the planning system more generally. And RTPI, Scotland's latest publication on key trends and findings at the end of last year, painted quite a stark picture in terms of falling budgets, numbers of planners and ageing workforce. Can you talk us through, we don't want to finish up all too depressed on the call, but talk us through some of the headlines from that work at the year end?
Yes, it's pretty depressing. So that's an annual review that we've been doing using the returns from the planning performance frameworks that all of the authorities collate earlier in the year. And yes, the most recent figures show the smallest public sector planning workforce for 5 years. So we see, falling numbers of people in local authority planning teams, and a really significant cut in budget. So that long-term impact of austerity on planning budgets. And we know that some of that's to do with, local authority budgets and pressures that they're under, and the kind of the statutory requirements to do particular things absorbing budget. And so planning, kind of having this kind of gentle, maybe not so gentle, slicing away of their budgets and paring back over the years. And I think one of the other things that came through was about planning fees. So we saw some uplift in fee income in 2022 with an increase in the planning fees, but the impacts of that are very unclear. It's not the case that all authorities have had more fee income as a result of that. And certainly some of the anecdotal stories that I've been hearing are that even where authorities have had more planning fees coming in, that has not been returned to the planning service, that is again being absorbed by the other pressures on local authority budgets, which is kind of one of, it was seen as a way of helping to get more resource into planning, but it doesn't appear to have done that. And it may be that something's going to switch miraculously, but we have our suspicions about that. So it's a pretty gloomy picture, I think, if we just look at those statistics.
Karen and Caroline, we've got a question in that's related to this topic. We've been asked, do we know if the cost of the MPF4 in terms of the new duties and responsibilities for planning authorities and applicants, and is the financial memorandum to be refreshed or updated? I don't know, Caroline, if you've got any thoughts on that.
I don't know. Sorry. It's one of our worries at the Institute was about the number of duties, the additional things that planners are being asked to do, and we didn't see any resource coming to help with that. And I don't know the answer to that question, I'm afraid.
I think there was certainly some scepticism at the time in terms of the way it had been dealt with in the financial memorandum, perhaps in a terribly optimistic way. So I certainly haven't heard anything to that effect, but I'm sure it's something that will be being sort of generally monitored in terms of just the extra burdens on planning authorities as part of the ongoing resourcing work. But I suppose just on that topic, and it's maybe very relevant to just where we are, that the Scottish Government have actually just launched their consultation on resourcing of the planning system. And I think this was something that had followed on from earlier workshops with stakeholders that had taken place in November. You'd have obviously been involved in all of that, which has led to the consultation coming out now with a number of, some fairly, I think, practical and not perhaps surprising themes being discussed there around things like proportionality. That wouldn't be a new discussion to us in planning, where we've had to look at previously the burden of some of the types of assessments that applicants have to get involved in, and officers are then having to deal with the review of. And we've spoken about it in the world of EIA before, but things like proportionality, standardization of approaches to certain documents, efficient working, all of these sound like sensible things for us to be talking about at this stage in the road. So I guess we'll have to see where that gets to. Certainly encourage everybody that's on the call to have a look at that on the Scottish Government website if you haven't seen that popping up so far. But I wonder if that gives some cause for optimism, Caroline, just in the sense that, Scottish Government are obviously recognising the issue there, perhaps recognising that some meaningful action is going to be required, whether that's financial or otherwise, to deal with these challenges that we're facing within planning.
Yeah, well, I think it's worth, I'm a glass half full sort of person, so I think it's worth taking the positives out of this. Resourcing and doing things better, doing better things are a really significant shared theme across the nations, and I think that's something else to be aware of. So Wales, RTPI Wales has done some work on efficiency in planning and ideas about how authorities can do things better, and the Republic of Ireland and England are also facing some of these issues around resources. Even if there's funding there aren't necessarily the number of planners there to fill all of the posts and do all of the things. So we've got this ongoing challenge, and yeah, it's really interesting that it's not just a conversation that's happening in the planning profession. I think the message has got out there. So we've seen house builders talking about it. The housing minister was talking about it in October last year at the Homes for Scotland event. The CMA report even mentioned that resourcing in the planning sector is one of the issues, one of the bottlenecks on housing delivery. There aren't enough planners to determine the applications. Then this has a knock-on. This has a recognisable knock-on. So yeah, it's a big issue, but there are some good parts to this. I think lots of people talking about positive examples, how we learn from best practice, how we share the things that we're already doing in the existing system. So how are we making things work rather than writing a big long list of new things to change? Looking at how is it that this authority manages to get all of their legal agreements turned around quickly, or this authority manages to get all of their major development applications through in 12 weeks. How are they doing that? What are they doing? What can we learn from that? And we've had some success as an institute in England, getting some more resource from the government to support local authorities. And we for things like bursaries and additional staff. We'd love to obviously replicate that in Scotland, but I think the financial settlement and the budgets that was confirmed yesterday with the significant cuts to social housing spend and the loss of the digital planning programme, it's that's a bit of a tough ask. But I think the consultation that's come out is a really, as I say, it's a positive story about innovating and doing better things, doing things better in our system, making it work. And it strikes me that it's not just the Scottish Government saying that, it's not just the profession that's saying that, it's house builders and developers and communities also want it to work, and are also willing to kind of, come forward with ideas about how we do that.
And you mentioned, just for Caroline, for anyone that hasn't seen this sort of popping up this week, so you mentioned the CMA report. So that's the Competition and Markets Authority final report into house building, which has come out this week and has a section on Scotland, which is obviously interesting for anyone who's interested in planning to have a look at, and just looking at some of those barriers to house building and the numbers coming through that we're needing to see. But planning is definitely one of the key themes that it's picked up there, not just looking at, I guess, the efficiency of the system, but lack of predictability. And again, that's sort of theme of certainty being one of the things that is picked up in the Scottish Government consultation. So I suppose just thinking again about on the resourcing question, it's not just about the finances, but as you say, it's about people coming into the system, recognising that ageing workforce and the need to attract new entrants into planning, public, particularly I think the public sector at this time. And it's something that we've discussed before on Planning Live in terms of the Future Planners project. But coming back to this idea of young people and their interest in planning, I think it's clear that needs to be part of the answer in selling planning as a professional as a profession to younger people, getting young people excited about that. And I know that adding planning to the school curriculum has been one idea that's been mooted as part of an answer, and having those conversations. But what are your views on how it is that we get that we get those positive messages out there about planning, so that people are seeing it as that career option that they might not have known about before?
Yeah, well, there's no one magic answer to this. There's lots of different route ways, but I think local place plans, I'm hearing from members that's enabling people to have some really interesting conversations with local people, young people, and it fits really well with high schools. The scale of a local place plan often fits very nicely with a kind of high school catchment. It also links to sorts of things that are happening in the geography curriculum and modern studies curriculums. So I think that's one of the reasons that some young people anyway are engaging with those things. They can relate to talking about their neighbourhood, can't they? In a way that it's hard to relate to a discussion about NPF4 and biodiversity policy, or policy 11 or whatever it is. It's relating to a real place and their own lived experience. And I think having young people involved in those conversations with real planners hopefully will alert them to the fact that there is this thing called planning, and then maybe they'll be more receptive when somebody does a talk at school about being a planner or working in the built environment, or they know that you don't just have to be an architect or a civil engineer to work in built environments. So I'm really hopeful that in time we'll see a generation of young people who've been involved in things like local place plans and youth parliaments and things coming through into the profession. And if anyone's doing any work in schools and they want any materials, we've got some very nice leaflets about planning careers. Just give me a shout. I can send you a little bundle and you can take them with you. But I think that's the other thing, is that all of us could be champions for our profession and talk about what we do in a positive way with young people. And I think that's one of the other things that switched around fairly recently is that people are starting to see planning as, you know, this positive thing that you can do. It isn't just about stopping development from happening, you know, being bureaucratic. It's also this wider placemaking, 20-minute neighborhoods, livable neighborhoods, and you know, making places healthy and livable and sustainable. And that's quite attractive to young people. So hopefully the revolution starts here.
Absolutely, and you heard here, everyone. Do get in touch with Caroline to get those resources, to get those positive messages out there. So I know, Caroline, that your new president started with the RTPI just last month, Lindsay, and one of her visions for I suppose the coming year is this planning for our future, which, you know, is very much around these things that we've been talking about in terms of creating those positive stories and around tackling, you know, what everyone recognises to be those key challenges of today, like climate change, health and well-being. I think perhaps some stuff for us to look out for on that front in terms of the work that Lindsay's going to be bringing forward.
So she did say in her presidential address that she wanted all of us to become influencers and, you know, be, as I say, be out there and being positive about planning and influencing new generations. I don't think that means you have to do it all on TikTok, but you can do that if you wish. Yes, so Lindsay has been behind a new initiative which is called Balance, which she also announced in her presidential inauguration address. Some of the details around Balance and exactly how it's going to work haven't yet been made public, but that project is going to be about outreach into and working with young people in different parts of the country, so different neighbourhoods and different communities. There is some secret news which I'm only just going to very briefly mention, but we are working on something else which would be about supporting young people to study, and hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll have a big announcement that we can make really soon about that. So there's lots of these things happening around, you know, promoting planning to young people, but also creating routeways for people who are interested in planning to come into the profession. So supporting people into college, into university to study, and finding support mechanisms for that. So yeah, watch this space. So be an influencer firstly, but watch this space for some of the other things happening. And again, if you're doing anything with young people, get in touch with us, because we do have resources, and when some of these details come out, there may be extra things that you can pick up.
All sounds very good to hear. I think we can be looking out for that. And then, Caroline, I suppose just reflecting on, and obviously as you've said, your role involves not just Scotland, not just England, but Wales too. So you're getting very much that sense of some of the, I suppose, the different approaches that are being taken across the different jurisdictions. And while we're perhaps seeing some what we might regard as more negative, perhaps punitive measures emerging elsewhere in planning systems, and we've chosen not to go down that path in Scotland. We've got all the great work that is now being done under Craig's auspices and his new sort of champion role, and really trying to take a more positive approach to our planning in Scotland, of working positively and in a sort of encouraging fashion to encourage those good results, rather than taking that more negative approach. You know, is that something that we can be proud of here, and really try to make the best of in looking for positive planning outcomes?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, you know, we can be incredibly hard on ourselves in Scotland, you know, when we like to pick out the detail and look at what's wrong with, you know, what's wrong with things, what's wrong with NPF4. I heard somebody saying that last week. There's, you know, we need to fix NPF4, and I was thinking it's only a year old. We haven't worked out what it means yet. But I think we should be positive, actually, because in Ireland, there are proposals in their planning and development bill that local authorities would be fined for not determining an application within the required timeline. And I think south of the border in England, there are also proposals on the table to use some metrics to measure planning performance, and again, kind of have negative measures around planning performance and planning authorities. And I think Scotland's leading the way in this idea of actually using positive feedback and mutual support to improve performance. So Craig's work is really around that kind of having measures and having quantifiable data that is used as a benchmark, but also having a narrative around things, because it might be that in your authority, yes, you have lost planners and you've got a smaller team this year than you had last year, but actually the reason for that is because you've got some systems or you've done something that which made, you know, you didn't need that number of planners anymore, so you're delivering a better service in a more efficient way. So there's kind of these complex things around planning and how it works. It isn't simply a question of numbers, not simply a question of the number of applications, the speed that you determine an application, the number of planners. It's much more nuanced than that. Are you making the right decisions? Are you allocating the sites? Are you providing your customers with good service and supports? Are you getting good outcomes on the ground? And so I think, you know, I think there's a lot to be said for that positive approach to not focus on the barriers and the problems, that actually look for solutions. We're already doing some really good things. Sharing that and learning from that is a way to get everybody to do that. So I think I said earlier, you know, some authorities are doing things, they're meeting their 12-week target, they're producing really good quality developments. How are they doing that? What can we learn and what can we share across other authorities to help them on that journey?
I think that is a very positive note for us to finish on. And as we look forward to another year of working with NPF4, I think it's really how we can all make the best of it and try to achieve those objectives that the Scottish Government was aiming to achieve with that ambitious document. So can I hand back to you now, Arlene, to tell us about what's coming up next?
Thanks, Karen. Yes, before we finish up, our next webinar is a planning case law update, which will be on the 14th of March. Neil, George and myself will be giving an update on recent court decisions in Scotland and England on the planning issues. That includes the Hillside decision, variations of planning conditions and enforcement. Thank you all to everybody who's joined us today, and special thanks to our guest, Dr. Brown. Thank you, Caroline and Karen.
Thank you very much from me too. Thanks. Goodbye, everyone.